Kurt Behrendt has curated dozens, literally dozens of exhibitions, notably at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, including Buddhism along the Silk Road 2012. And I think I saw that, but I didn't pay attention to the name of the curator. And then other exhibitions, Buddhist-themed exhibitions over the years, until last year, the exhibition of mandalas that I did not see. It ran for 4 months, I believe. Unfortunately, those 4 months I was commuting with Europe and China, and I didn't have a chance to stop in New York. But this time I wrote down the name of the curator, and that's why we are here today. So I invited Kurt to give us a presentation on mandalas. Okay, that's it. Again, if you go to lasertalks.com, you find a longer bio and links and so on. And by the way, I don't remember exactly where, but there are YouTube videos that talk about that exhibition. Now, I don't remember exactly what I saw, but I remember seeing something like a 1-hour video, not just 10 minutes. Okay. Anyway, all yours. I shut up. I'll let you do your show.
Thank you. And just to follow up on what you're saying, there's a catalog that
and the catalog, of course,
discusses a lot of the issues I'll bring up today. Let me share my screen. Okay. Well, let me just begin with a mandala. My talk today is really is centered on Tibet and the Himalayas more generally, between the 11th and perhaps as late as the 15th century. And here we're looking at a 14th century mandala. And just to give you some bearings as to how a mandala functions, I think this is a good way to start. When the Buddha reached enlightenment, he reached down, touched the earth, calling it to witness his past actions. And at that time, that moment of epiphany, he had his physical body, which produced relics, the Dharma itself, his teachings, and a mind-made body. And this is the key, especially for this idea of celestial Buddhas. He traveled to the highest heaven, where he preached the Dharma to the Buddhas of the 10 directions, and they crown him. And that's what we see at the very center of this. I'm sorry for it being blurry, but it's a very tiny detail. He's crowned, and at that moment he descends to Mount Meru, and he preaches to and emanates Buddhas in the 4 directions. And here we see these emanating Buddhas, each of which are color-coded. Probably most famous is Amitabha, who here is actually shown at the top, but is in the West. These celestial Buddhas are central to Buddhist practice, right? In turn, each of them emanate bodhisattvas, and there are conceptually 1,000 bodhisattvas here. I haven't actually counted them. I imagine not quite 1,000, but with Tibet, sometimes this accuracy is really does play out. All of this material sits within a palace or a temple, which is the square, and you can see gateways in the 4 directions. Okay, so these are all components of every mandala we'll look at today. Surrounding is a band of fire forming a circle, and that demarks the sacred space of the mandala versus the surrounding context. And these mandalas were actually painted on cloth so they could be rolled up and transported. They would move with ascetics and itinerant monks who were doing these tantric practices associated with mandalas. Now, all this is sort of important because the Tibetan mandala is actually a departure from this idea of fixed geography that dominated North Indian ideas, that you create a piece of sacred geography it's sacred because you've purified it and it is fixed. And in fact, in Tibet, this is why there are sand mandalas that, in a sense, fix sacred geography, and then they're swept away when they're finished. So these painted mandalas are really quite different and significant in that way. That simple portability meant that they had to be charged with all sorts of secondary symbolism to purify the space, a topic I'll touch on. Okay, so now who are they made for? They certainly were being produced by the most elite craftspeople, and we find a range of styles, but consistently, whether they were produced for monastic elites like this Kadampa monk that we see here, who is probably a patriarch, or for royal patrons, the very best artists were employed. And I find this interesting in that the rituals, esoteric rituals, tantric rituals that were being conducted are secret. They're hidden. And because you have these hidden rituals, and then oftentimes the mandala would be then rolled up and taken off view. So they were only briefly used, and yet they're so finely and beautifully executed. Before I leave my Lama here, a word or two is sort of when these tantric texts were flowing up from India. There was this idea of teachers, right? A text is meaningless without its subtle interpretation, and so of transmission. And I particularly like, it's not a mandala, but it makes the point beautifully, I think. Here we see the monastic leader Tashipel sitting above an image of Hevajra. Okay. His student, while Tashipel was alive, took footprints from him. And this is an idea of relics that goes all the way back to the time of the Buddha. He took these impressions of Tashipel's feet, which were then affixed. They're actually on separate silk pieces that were affixed to the painting. And so the student, who Tashipel is teaching the subtle doctrine to, sees Tashipel as equivalent to Hevajra. And they become one and the same. And there's this idea of guru rusha, but you can see the idea that Tashipel has mastered this subtle doctrine and can evoke Hevajra, and in a sense becomes Hevajra. And this whole issue of evocation is quite significant. Now, this idea of lineage then plays back to India. So you have teachers tracing themselves back generation after generation, and ultimately to people who traveled down onto the Indian subcontinent, where they encountered these siddhas, these mahasiddhas. These are quasi mythic. Some of them are certainly people, others we're less certain about. This painting, I think, is a good example of a mahasiddha done in the 13th century. We actually have labels on the back identifying the 84 mahasiddhas that you see in the background, and in the center is Virupa. Now, a mahasiddha were rejecting monasticism. They left the monasteries, they retreated to the forests like the Buddha, but they practiced all sorts of things that were against Buddhist doctrine. I mean, they drank alcohol, sex was involved in some of this ritual, impure substances, and so on. And by going down this sort of dangerous path, one could harness power, a city. And a city would allow you to fly through the air to attract lovers. In this case, Virupa is at a tavern and he's drinking whiskey, and his bill comes due, and they say, the sun is setting, you have to pay your due, we're not going to serve you anymore. And he reaches up and stops the sun in the sky. So the mahasiddhas had this great power, and one of the things, of course, they harnessed was one could use a siddha to actually reach enlightenment. And so these Mahasiddhas then are the progenitors of Tantrism. And different schools of Tibetan Buddhism trace their lineage back to various of these Mahasiddhas. Now, getting back to a mandala, all of this becomes quite important when we start looking at these diagrams. And I draw your attention to this one, which is Chakrasambhara and his consort, which was produced in Nepal, probably about 1100. Early C14 tests reveal this to be perhaps, anyways, one of the very earliest mandalas from the Himalayan region. And in the center, Chakrasambhara stands surrounded by Dakini, who brings secret knowledge, within the square of this temple. In a way, it's a much simpler mandala than we saw before. Chakrasambhara being a deity, a tantric deity, very much running parallel to ideas surrounding esoteric practices. So I think it's an interesting moment. One aligns themselves with a Buddhist tantric deity, becoming or discovering perhaps that deity within yourself, as opposed to Hinduism, for instance, where a temple provides a seat for the deity in the hope of having darshan. So related, but the Buddhists take a more pragmatic view. Now, but really what's interesting about this particular mandala is outside the sacred area of the inner circle are all of these figures that are in the, are conceptually in charnel grounds, in the cremation areas, but also where bodies were discarded for sky burial. And you see birds and so on. But within this space, this liminal space, this impure space, are Mahasiddhas. And I mean, you could pick through it and I could find Siddhas here. And I think it's quite compelling that the Mahasiddhas are in that transition space between our realm of existence and the pure, uncorrupted realm of Chakrasambhara in his temple at the center. And I would just note, if you look in the very bottom corner, you have a practitioner sitting before a mandala. So this idea of access and of presenting the deity, I think, sort of really stands out. And my talk today is really talking about the aesthetic, the Mandalic aesthetic. And it's worth thinking about as I go through these next mandalas, just have a look. Many of them are done by different workshops, so I'm not trying to get at a specific form, but that for the patron, for the monastic community, creating something that was sublime and beautiful, that's exceptional, clearly is important if you are going to actually use this kind of a diagram to successfully evoke a deity. For example, here we are maybe in the 12th century, and this mandala is devoted to a deity called Manjuvajra. Here, I'll just show you a detail of the center. Manjuvajra is a tantric form of Manjushri, is a bodhisattva that provides access to the Buddha's Dharma, to his teachings. He's bodhisattva of wisdom, but one venerates Manjushri, and by extension, one venerates Manjuvajra to have deeper understanding of texts, to speak eloquently. Certainly all ideas that are central to monastic practice and the transmission of texts. And we, it's not surprising. And the evocative detail was, this is a large format, expensive mandala, produced at the highest level for monastic use. And I would again argue this aesthetic, this idea of beauty, if you want to say, runs through Buddhism. An image is only as effective as it is evocative.
Now, these monks gained great power as ritual specialists. This is true within Tibet itself. Certainly by the Yuan dynasty, when this mandala was produced, it's almost 12 feet tall. It's a woven silk kesu done for the Chinese court. And at the very center, we see Vajra Bhairava. He goes on to actually remain quite important to Chinese tantric tradition, even into to today. In the 18th, 19th century, we find a lot of Vajra Bhairava imagery. Now, Vajra Bhairava, in simplest terms, is a destroyer of death, a defeater of death. One is caught in the cycle of rebirth, and by defeating death, one could hope to escape the cycle of rebirth and reach enlightenment. So one can see immediately why this would appeal to a kingly elite who are looking to reach enlightenment. And you can see why the commission of such an expensive, lavish work of art, if in fact the grandiosity and the quality is at play, then of course you spend any amount of money to make as great an object as possible. And I think that's certainly at play here. Also, one of the things that I find particularly interesting about this work, which was done about 1332, is its conformity to the Tibetan model. I mean, we have Vajra Bhairava, oh, what am I saying? Yeah, at the center within this palace, the 8 charnel grounds, now interestingly integrated into the circle of the mandala rather than being in the fill. But then above are monastic patriarchs, going back to a Mahasiddha here, and below lots of protector iconography. If we were at any doubt as to who this was made for, we have Tug Timur and his brother, the great-grandsons of Kublai Khan. So Mughal emperors, and in the other corner are their wives. So they commissioned this work. They bring in Tibetan ritual specialists in order to achieve certain specific goals. Now, I feel kind of as though I'm simplifying this tradition. I mean, they're wildly complicated, but this is easily pulled apart, as are most of the examples I've shown you. But I would just like to call attention to a mandala like this. This is a Chemchak Haruka mandala, probably produced right into the 12th century, an early example from Tibet. And we know who some of its owners were, and where it moved within certain Tibetan monasteries. Clearly an important work, done probably by North Indian artists. And I know you haven't seen that many mandalas at this stage, but note the bold use of color here. How the prongs at the gates, which form vajras, you can see the tower of the gate has these 2 prongs, and they cross underneath the central deity, forming stability. They're all done, this is all done in primary colors. This is typical of North India, which we know from manuscript illustrations. It's the kind of early mandala that we can imagine being transmitted out of North India. And sadly, we know of patas from North India from literary sources, but they have all been destroyed. The monsoon climate was not as kind as the cold, dry winters of Tibet in terms of the survivability of these kinds of objects. So we have this, yet again, another style. And here, when we look into the center of the mandala, the primary deity, but then surrounding is a body of iconography, and these almost read as sub-mandalas. In other words, I believe, I think there's good evidence to suggest that the artists and monastic advisors creating this complex iconography were packing a lot in. We find esoteric versions of a whole variety of bodhisattvas, making it very hard to understand how this specifically was used. And that isn't the case in the later centuries. So I think that it's interesting we start with complexity and we move towards something that is more self-evident. But once again, I think the quality and the versatility, I think, is self-evident. If I had more time, I certainly could go into greater detail, but wanted to give you a taste for this aesthetic and for this larger body of what really ultimately becomes central to East Asian practice, Southeast Asia, Japan, certainly in this 12th to 15th century and before. Tantra had great sway. Anyways, I think at this point I will stop and take some questions.
Yeah, splendid. By the way, the catalog is available on the Metropolitan website.
Or through Amazon, actually.
Or to Amazon, of course. And it has beautiful pictures, even if you if you don't want all the historical and philosophical details. Now, I have a question for you. When I was in Tibet the first time, there's one thing that struck me. I saw the mandalas in the museums and so on, but I also saw the sand mandalas. These are made by nuns. At least I only saw nuns making them. I assume they were nuns, they were women. And so it struck me that number one, they were made by nuns, by women. And number two, obviously they were made to be destroyed. I mean, made of sand. So right. My question for you is, what do you think? What came first, the sand mandala or the painted mandala? It sounds like the painted mandala requires materials more sophisticated.
Absolutely. I think that it absolutely goes back. Well, it's a tricky question because you could go all the way back to Vedic times and scratch a square on the ground for a Vedic fire altar, circle it, draw a circle around it for the intermediate directions, align it with the setting sun, the rising sun. And suddenly it looks very much like a mandala, right? Which serves as the basis for Hindu temples, for Buddhist stupas, and so on. So we can drag that through time. And I think, so the sand mandala it's hard to know when the first sand mandalas were created, being that they're so temporary. But I would see them as being something at least much more acceptable within the Indian context than a painted mandala. And I would think that painted mandalas follow centuries before any of these, and we just simply don't have them. But to turn to the sand mandalas themselves, they're typically used for initiation. In other words, if you are a monastic student and you want to study the Chakrasamvara literature, you must first be initiated to Chakrasamvara. You must be aligned. Sloppy term. Sanderson coined it many years ago. But by aligning yourself to a certain deity, you then proceed to devote years and years of study to those tantras. And that happens with a sand mandala. And then it's destroyed. Now, several people might be initiated at a moment, but the sand mandala is typically built for that purpose, and then swept away, and usually thrown into a river, to purify. And it's then swept away. I've seen sand mandalas created by monks also in Ladakh and Tibet, but not by nuns. Although, I'm not surprised. I don't know of historic instances of nuns doing tantric ritual, but maybe it's simply not something that Buddhist texts are fairly male dominated in terms of their discussion. Nuns are always suspect, right? There was this whole business of the early nuns having to live separate from the monks and live in cities, and then there were no nuns at all at a point. And then, there's the whole business of lineage ordination and all of this. So it's a very interesting question, and I don't know the answer. It would be worth studying.
And my other question is about my favorite mandala, which is a building, not a painting, Borobudur. I was
Yes.
just there for the third time last year. And so what's the relationship between the painted mandala and the architectural mandala? Of course, it's not only Borobudur. I know there are buildings designed as mandalas also in Bangladesh, I believe, probably India.
Yeah, Paharpur, Antichak are also big built structures. And like Borobudur, all of them relate to these celestial Buddhas that I began with. That very first Vajradhatu mandala explains a lot of Borobudur, right? The idea of these Avakshobhya and the four directional Buddhas are prominent at Borobudur. They're up on the upper levels, and so they get less attention only because they're not narrative, right? It's so tempting to read the Lalita Vistra and the Kandavyuha and all these early texts that are presented at Borobudur, making it very difficult to interpret structure. But then, like this Chemchak Haruka mandala, I suspect we are just missing the person who ties it all together neatly, right? It's probably a combination of tradition that underlies Borobudur. I think any built mandala is going to be more powerful than a painted one, always. And there certainly are no shortage of built mandalas. Any temple, fundamentally, if you look at it, you can start to find these structures within it. Though building mandalas to esoteric deities is not so often seen, right, in Tibet. We find the Buddha sitting at the center of big halls that are, there's this whole issue of the public depend on us monastic elites to do ritual on their behalf and bring prosperity to the kingdom and protect the kingdom from war and so on. Hence the importance of the Dalai Lama, who does ritual. This is the function of a Dalai Lama, is to bring prosperity to the people.
What do you think is the current state of this art form in Tibet? Of course, now there are mandala artists all over the world. I even saw a mandala exhibition in Africa. But in Tibet itself, given the political, social changes that happened in the last half century, what do you think is the state of this art form in Tibet?
Well, interestingly, it almost seems like we're finding tantric deities appearing in wall paintings across Tibet right now, and Nepal and Ladakh. So as these wall paintings are damaged and being refreshed, which sometimes is shocking, I think, as an art historian, to paint over an ancient painting. It's disturbing, but nonetheless, there's a whole new sort of painting style, and you find groups of tantric deities appearing in wall paintings, and it's a contradiction. They shouldn't be there; they should be hidden, and they're not appearing in mandalas so much as deities suitable for veneration being presented one after the next. And so I think it's a living tradition, and yet it certainly seems to be undergoing transformation in the last 50 years. Because this kind of mural painting is new, but it is across the Himalayan region. So it's clearly something that has relevance.
Another factor that's worth bringing in, if you go to a site like Alchi, you get sets of mandalas. So you don't have a single mandala, you'll have 20 mandalas. And there are a few texts that the Vajravali talks about 42 mandalas, and we find a couple sets of these 42 mandalas. But at Alchi, these are mandalas that are not from a single text. And so there is this interesting juxtaposition of deity. I don't know. I think that the study of Tibet and esoteric practice isn't fully understood and worthy of more study and discussion.
Okay, I see two questions. So the first one is just asking if there's a companion document showing the names of the mandalas that you showed. I guess we don't have a companion document. I mean, they are in the catalog, right?
Yes, yes. Everything that I'm showing you today was actually part of that exhibition.
Catalog. And the second question, Amy, she's just, yeah, so are you aware of gender discrimination in monks versus nuns across history in different countries? Yeah, yes, of course. I'm a Catholic from Italy, so I'm aware of the different ways that women and that convents and the monasteries are organized.
Although today, many nunneries, and this is a popular and well-supported tradition in Bhutan and Tibet, Ladakh. Many women retreat to the monastery at a stage in their life, or attend religious ceremonies. And this is not saying that there isn't discrimination, but it's interesting that the nuns are so important. I think as existent, right? There's good patronage. How about that? Of all of these nunneries, and many of them are quite old, so it's not a new phenomenon. It's
Yeah, that's so. Personally, I wasn't when I noticed the women making the sand mandala that then get destroyed, and it doesn't become an art collector item. I was intrigued, probably because I was coming from India, and I had been intrigued by the columns made by Indian women in South India in front of their house every morning. You see them painting with chalk. So it was just the fact that sometimes women develop their own art form that doesn't become, again, that doesn't go into the art world and sold for thousands of dollars. It's more spontaneous, and it's just a different concept. So personally, probably I came from that viewpoint. That's why I was attracted to the sand mandala. That's all.
Sure. No, and it's absolutely true. And we don't have record of them because the Buddhist texts, especially Buddhist texts, is purely masculine discourse. I mean, you rarely have nuns entering into that discussion. Not that they're completely absent, but they're not prominent, certainly.
Okay, thank you very much. And
yes.
Excellent. So anybody who wants to know more, there's a catalog about that exhibition. And Kurt, thank you very much for doing this for us.